Picture this. The air inside the Alcázar of Madrid is so dense with incense and heat that every breath feels like swallowing smoke. Outside, the summer sun of 1665 AD bakes the palace stones until they radiate like embers beneath the skin. Inside a dim chamber, candlelight flickers against crimson walls, and beyond the heavy oak doors comes the sound, sharp, primal, unending, of a woman's scream. It is Queen Mariana of Austria, niece and wife to King Philip IV of Spain. Her cries rise and fall like waves against the walls, echoing through corridors where courtiers whisper behind gloved hands. Some mutter prayers, others tremble with unspoken dread. They all know this birth is no ordinary event. It is the culmination of nearly 2 centuries of deliberate choices. Each scream marks the moment when a dynasty's arrogance turns to flesh, when an empire that sought immortality gives birth to its undoing. Outside her chamber, Philip IV, the aging king, her uncle, her husband, paces in silence. His boots strike the marble in slow, rhythmic steps, each one betraying a lifetime of burdens he cannot name aloud. He has seen Spain's glory fade, the once invincible armadas shattered, silver fleets lost, colonies restless. But none of that frightens him as much as what might emerge from behind those doors. The courtiers can smell blood and fear seeping through the cracks like dampness. The air is thick with superstition. Every flicker of a candle feels like an omen, every creak of the floor like a whisper from God. For decades, priests have assured the royal family that their bloodline is sacred, that keeping it pure preserves divine favor. But tonight, the very sanctity of that belief trembles. Mariana's attendants move like ghosts, women in white linen, hands stained red, faces pale under the candlelight. They whisper Hail Marys between orders, their eyes darting to the crucifix above the bed. Some believe the queen is cursed. Others think she is a vessel of divine judgment. When the child finally emerges, the silence that follows is not relief. It is horror. The midwife's face goes pale. The child's cry is weak, almost broken. And when she turns him toward the light, every soul in the room sees it, the warped symmetry of nature itself. The infant's head is too large for his body, his jaw unnaturally long, his lips swollen and drooping, his limbs tremble as though made of wax. They name him Charles Carlos, Prince of Spain, the long-awaited heir. But in the eyes of those present, he is something else, a living mirror reflecting centuries of sin disguised as devotion. The Habsburgs did not stumble into this curse, they built it, brick by brick, marriage by marriage. For generations, the family has bound itself together in an ever-tightening circle, each union between uncle and niece, cousin and cousin, crafted not for love but for power. The dynasty's motto, Bella gerent alii, tu Felix Austria nube, let others wage war. You, happy Austria. Marry was once the secret to their empire. But the empire that stretched from the Andes to the Alps has become a house made of mirrors, each reflection weaker than the last. Outside the Queen's chamber, the courtiers whisper what no one dares speak aloud, that the Spanish Habsburg line is collapsing. The previous heirs, Prince Philip Prospero and Maria Theresa, had died young, too frail to live past infancy. Now all hope rests upon this fragile, trembling child, born of uncle and niece. A priest kneels beside the newborn's cradle, sprinkling holy water over his face. May God preserve Spain, he whispers. But even God, it seems, looks away. As the palace bells toll the hour, the kingdom holds its breath. The fate of an empire lies in the cradle of a dying lineage. In the narrow corridors, servants cross themselves and avoid meeting each other's eyes. They speak of the curse in murmurs. Some say it began generations ago in Vienna, others that it was born of pride, when emperors believed they could shape destiny through marriage contracts. The royal physician writes in his record that the infant's breathing is shallow, his color pale, and that the child bears the unmistakable mark of his blood. Yet he cannot name what that mark is. None of them can. The science of heredity is centuries away. What they see as divine punishment is in truth a slow unraveling written into their bones. Philip IV enters the chamber at last. The Queen lies motionless, her face wet with tears and sweat. He stands over the cradle, staring at his son, as though looking into the abyss of his own making. Behind him, the attending priest mutters a blessing, but the king does not hear it. The only sound that fills the room is the child's faint, wheezing breath. Outside, the sun sinks behind the horizon, and shadows crawl across Madrid. The Alcázar, once the glittering symbol of Spain's might, feels like a mausoleum. Every portrait on the wall seems to watch in judgment. Generations of proud Habsburg faces, jaws jutting forward, eyes cold and distant. In that moment, history itself seems to hold its breath. This is not merely the birth of a prince. It is the reckoning of 2 centuries of obsession. A dynasty that once ruled half the world has finally bred the limits of its own ambition into existence. And as night falls, the queen's chamber grows still. The child, frail, twitching, sleeps. The courtiers disperse in silence, their silk slippers whispering across the marble floors. The empire outside carries on, unaware that in this cradle lies the echo of its ruin. The story of Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, does not begin with his life. It begins here in the suffocating heat of a Madrid summer, with a woman who was both mother and niece, and a king who mistook divine right for divine immunity. From this birth, a chain of tragedy will unwind, one that stretches back to the earliest days of the Habsburg Empire, to the moment when power and blood became one and the same. To understand the horror that took shape in that dim Madrid chamber, we must journey backward across centuries, across kingdoms, across a dynasty that mistook power for permanence. The Habsburgs were not merely rulers, they were architects of a living experiment, and their blueprint was the human body itself. The story begins in the late 1400s, with Emperor Maximilian I, the man who transformed marriage into an instrument of empire. He was not a conqueror by the sword but by the wedding ring. Through one strategic union after another, he carved a path across Europe without shedding blood. His family's motto became legend: "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." And marry they did again and again, until the Habsburg blood ran like a closed circle. From Maximilian's vision sprang an empire that spanned the known world. By the early 1500s, Charles V, his grandson, would inherit a realm so vast that the sun literally never set upon it. Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and the New World beyond the Atlantic. But within that grandeur lay a quiet, invisible rot. Charles V himself was already the product of a first-cousin marriage. His parents, Philip the Handsome of Castile and Joanna the Mad, shared grandparents. In his portraits, painted by Titian, the early signs of the Habsburg jaw are subtle, a lower lip slightly too pronounced, a chin that juts forward in quiet defiance of symmetry. It was not yet monstrous, merely a whisper of what was to come. When Charles abdicated in 1556 AD, weary of rule and haunted by his own frailty, he divided the empire between 2 branches, his brother Ferdinand I and his son Philip II in Spain. What might have been a safeguard became a curse. Their lines, though divided by territory, remained intertwined by blood. The 2 branches would spend the next century marrying into one another, again and again, as though terrified of introducing new life from beyond their sacred circle. Philip II became the dynasty's genetic architect and its destroyer. A man of rigid faith and icy restraint, he ruled Spain at its height of wealth and power. Yet his devotion to preserving pure blood was almost religious. His first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, was his first cousin. She died in childbirth. His second, Mary of England, was a political alliance. His third, Elizabeth of Valois, was French, a rare exception, and when she died, he reverted to family tradition. At 43, Philip II married Anna of Austria, his 20-year-old niece. Their marriage, uncle to niece, was both celebrated and unsettling. To the court, it represented divine unity between the 2 Habsburg branches. To history, it marked the beginning of the end. From that union came Philip III, a child born with the quiet doom of his ancestors folded within his blood. In the language of genetics unknown to them, but merciless in its arithmetic, each close marriage compounded risk. Every time cousins wed, every time uncle met niece at the altar, the same flawed code was copied again and again, until what was once recessive became destiny. The Habsburgs' inbreeding coefficient rose generation after generation, from near zero to levels that would make nature itself recoil. But numbers mean little to men who believe themselves chosen by God. Philip III grew up in a court gilded with splendor and suffocated by piety. He was gentle, obedient, and unremarkable, the perfect heir for a family that prized obedience over vitality. When he took the throne in 1598, he continued his father's habits, avoiding conflict, marrying for blood, and leaving the running of the empire to his favorites. In 1599, he wed Margaret of Austria, his first cousin and, through multiple tangled lines, his blood double. Their children carried the invisible weight of generations. One of them, Philip IV, would inherit both a kingdom and the slow-burning ruin of his family's design. By the time Philip IV was born in 1605, Europe had begun to whisper about the Habsburg face, the broad lower jaw, the thick lip, the long chin that made speech and eating awkward. Artists tried to flatter their royal patrons, softening the angles, but the deformity grew too striking to conceal. When the young prince spoke, words slurred against the weight of his jaw. When he smiled, his teeth met unevenly, as though nature itself resisted obedience. Still, the Habsburgs ruled the greatest empire in the world. Who could tell them they were flawed? Across Europe, their portraits hung in golden frames, faces pale and elongated, chins thrust forward in proud defiance. Their blood was their banner, their faith, their weapon. Yet in secret, physicians recorded strange maladies among the royals, infants born weak and sickly, marriages that failed to produce heirs, sudden deaths that came without warning. In Austria and Spain alike, whispers spread among servants and scholars. Some said the Habsburgs had angered God with their pride. Others believed that the devil had taken their blood as his own. But the truth, cold and clinical, needed no devil. It was mathematics, the relentless certainty that what is repeated too often collapses into itself. Still, they persisted. Philip IV inherited not only his father's jaw but his fatal devotion to the family creed. He watched his once mighty Spain begin to falter, its treasuries drained, its armies defeated, its empire bleeding from the New World to Flanders. Yet in the quiet halls of his palace, he clung to the illusion of divine blood, believing that salvation would come not from strength, but from purity. At 44, surrounded by dying heirs and fading hopes, he looked again within his family for a bride. His choice would be his own niece, Mariana of Austria, a timid girl of 15, barely a woman, raised among the same ancestral ghosts that had haunted the dynasty for centuries. When their union was announced, the court celebrated with fireworks and prayers. The Pope himself blessed the marriage. Yet somewhere beneath the sound of the trumpets, fate laughed. For with every ring exchanged, the circle tightened further. And somewhere, deep within the coded spiral of the Habsburg bloodline, the final curse was waiting to be born. In the spring of 1649, Madrid shimmered under the glare of the Castilian sun as the city prepared for a royal wedding. The banners unfurled, bells pealed, and priests offered blessings to a kingdom desperate for renewal. Yet behind the pageantry stood a truth that no trumpet could drown out. The bride, Mariana of Austria, was not only the king's niece, but also his blood's mirror woven through the same ancestral threads that had long begun to fray. She was 15. Her husband, Philip IV of Spain, was 44. He had buried queens, mistresses, and sons, yet he approached this marriage with the quiet urgency of a man chasing salvation through repetition. The union was meant to heal Spain's wounds, to secure the line, to restore divine favor to a dynasty that had begun to whisper its prayers into empty rooms. Instead, it would summon the final act of a family's slow undoing. Mariana was raised in Vienna among the strict rituals of the Austrian court. She had been betrothed once before to Balthazar Charles, Philip's son, until death took him at 17. When the boy died, the Habsburg elders did not seek a new match. They simply reassigned the girl to his father. The arrangement was treated as practical, almost merciful. For the Habsburgs, blood had always mattered more than love, and convenience more than conscience. The wedding procession glittered with jewels and lace, but those who watched closely saw the nervous tremor in Mariana's hands. The girl who once dreamed of being a bride now became both daughter and wife to the same royal house. Her every breath weighed against the expectation of producing an heir. At the Spanish court, she found herself a stranger among ghosts. The walls of the Alcazar were lined with portraits of the same faces, different names, same jaws, same weary eyes. The resemblance was uncanny, as though the family had painted its own decline century after century, convinced it could immortalize itself through replication. Mariana tried to adapt to her role as queen, though the Spanish court was a suffocating labyrinth of etiquette and suspicion. She was watched constantly, her meals monitored, her sleep recorded, her monthly cycles whispered about by physicians and priests alike. Her every prayer was a petition for life, not her own, but for the children she would be commanded to bear. Her first pregnancy ended in tears. The second brought Philip Prospero, a fragile boy with luminous eyes and trembling limbs. His cradle was surrounded by relics, tiny saintly bones, crosses, holy oils, all meant to protect him from the unseen curse that haunted the royal blood. But divine protections meant little to biology. He coughed through his short years, grew pale as parchment, and died before reaching 5. When his body was carried through the palace, the sound of weeping filled the halls. The king, hardened by grief, fell silent. The queen fainted, and all of Spain understood, though none dared say it, that their future now depended on another child. The pressure on Mariana was merciless. In the silent hours of the night, she prayed until her voice broke. The courtiers spoke of her piety with reverence, unaware that her prayers were soaked in terror, for she knew what they would not admit. Every birth in this house carried the weight of every death before it. Each generation was another throw of the same cursed dice. In 1661, her womb carried again, but the child was stillborn. The whispers grew louder. Some blamed witchcraft. Others said it was divine punishment for the king's sins. Physicians argued over treatments, leeches, tonics, purges. No one understood that what they sought to cure was not illness, but the slow unraveling of blood. By the time 1665 arrived, the queen's body was frail, her nerves raw. The empire was collapsing, its armies defeated, its silver fleets vanished into foreign hands, its coffers empty. Even the church seemed powerless to stop the decay. In the palace, tapestries of glory hung beside cracked walls. The courtiers still bowed deeply, but their faith was thin as dust. When the queen went into labor on that suffocating summer morning, the palace trembled. Priests chanted outside her door. Servants knelt in corridors, clutching rosaries. Some believed a miracle was coming, that this child would save Spain. Others feared the opposite. Hours passed. Screams faded into groans. Blood soaked the linens. The king waited outside, motionless, lips pressed tight in prayer. And then, the silence. The midwife emerged at last, face pale, voice trembling. "The prince lives, but he is not well." They named him Charles Carlos II, heir to the Spanish throne, last hope of the Habsburgs. When the king first saw his son, witnesses say he wept not with joy, but with something deeper, darker. The child's features bore the unmistakable stamp of his lineage. The enormous head, the protruding jaw, the drooping mouth, the shallow breath. His tiny limbs twitched uncontrollably, as though his body were resisting the very act of life. The midwives crossed themselves. Some refused to speak of what they had seen. The priests declared it a test of faith. The physicians called it mystery. The truth was neither holy nor hidden. The truth was arithmetic. Charles's very existence was the sum of nearly 200 years of inbreeding, the condensed legacy of a dynasty that had folded itself inward until there was nowhere left to go. The Habsburg jaw, once a mere quirk, had now devoured its own bloodline. The court celebrated outwardly. Of course, Spain had an heir. Bells rang, processions marched, hymns rose into the evening sky. But within the palace walls, the servants moved in silence, carrying the newborn prince as though he were made of glass. The queen, pale and trembling, reached out to touch his face. The child barely stirred. "May God grant him strength," she whispered. But even as she spoke, a chill seemed to settle over the room. For everyone present knew that Spain's future had arrived small, gasping, and already broken. Outside, thunder rolled across Madrid, the air heavy with the scent of rain. The city below slept unaware that its empire's fate now rested in the trembling hands of a child who would never be strong enough to hold it. And so it began the reign of Charles II, the boy who would grow to embody both the pride and punishment of his house. In his veins flowed gold and poison alike, the inheritance of emperors and ghosts. The queen, who had survived where so many had perished, believed she had fulfilled her sacred duty. But as she watched her son struggle to breathe, she could not shake the thought that perhaps, in bringing him into the world, she had given birth not to salvation, but to prophecy fulfilled. The boy who was born under thunder grew into a man under whispers. From the moment Charles II opened his eyes to the flickering light of the Spanish court, his existence became a secret carefully managed by those around him. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. Some said witches had cursed him in his cradle. Others believed he was born under a shadow, his soul tethered between life and death. But behind the superstition was something far more tragic. Charles was simply the visible consequence of the Habsburg experiment, the breathing monument to 2 centuries of deliberate inbreeding. As a child, he could not walk without help. His head was too heavy for his neck, his legs too thin to bear his weight. He did not speak until the age of 4, and when he did, his words were slurred, his mouth working against the prison of his jaw. His tongue sat thick and swollen, his teeth misaligned. The royal tutors, in their reports, called him slow, but well-meaning. The courtiers called him Nuestro pobre rey, our poor king. Behind closed doors, his mother, Queen Mariana, ruled in his name. She signed decrees, met with ambassadors, and manipulated the intricate dance of power that surrounded her sickly son. She believed she could protect him both from the world and from the knowledge of his own fragility. But even within the palace walls, truth cannot be contained forever. Foreign envoys began to whisper. The French court, ever watchful, sent spies to Madrid who returned with unsettling tales, that the Spanish king drooled during audiences, that his eyes darted in confusion, that his attendants had to spoon-feed him soft porridge because he could not chew. He resembles a child trapped in a man's body, one diplomat wrote. Portraits painted of Charles II during his youth were carefully staged acts of deception. The artists were instructed to soften his deformities, paint him in armor, standing tall, his face turned to catch the light in just the right angle to hide the jutting jaw. The image of majesty had to be preserved, even as the reality behind it decayed. Spain itself mirrored its monarch, grand on the surface, rotting within. By the time Charles took the throne officially, the empire was in steep decline. Its once mighty fleets had been defeated, its colonies restless, its treasury empty. The gold from the Americas no longer flowed as before. Famine and plague haunted the countryside. The court, meanwhile, lived in denial, lavish feasts held in the same halls where servants whispered of demons and curses. Charles grew into manhood like a ghost haunting his own reign. Every day was a performance of kingship, the rituals, the blessings, the endless prayers. The court physicians, bewildered and terrified, prescribed holy relics, bloodletting, and exorcisms. They could not understand what plagued him. One declared that the king's body was the house of many spirits. But Charles's suffering was not only physical. His mind, trapped between superstition and confusion, was a battlefield of fear. He trusted no one. He would not eat unless a priest blessed his food first. He demanded that servants taste every dish for poison. He kept his mother close, yet suspected even her of secret plots. Still, the machinery of politics demanded that he marry. A king without an heir meant a nation without a future. And so, in 1679, at the age of 14, Charles was wed to Marie-Louise of Orléans, niece of the great Louis XIV of France. She was everything he was not: youthful, radiant, and alive. Their first meeting was recorded with awkward compassion. The young queen to be curtsied deeply. Charles, pale and trembling, could barely stand. His attendants had to support him under the arms to keep him upright. He looked at me, she wrote later, with eyes full of sorrow, as if he were apologizing for existing. Their marriage was a union of two nations, but in practice, it was a union of loneliness. The court expected an heir. The church prayed for one. But the Queen's letters to her mother in France revealed the truth. "He cannot perform his duties as a husband," she wrote, "and I believe he suffers greatly because of it." For 10 years, they remained childless. Marie-Louise grew frail and anxious, trapped in the gloom of the Spanish court where laughter was forbidden and the air hung heavy with incense. She began to fade, her letters grew darker, her handwriting shakier. Then, in 1689, at just 26 years old, she collapsed and died suddenly. "Poison," some whispered. "Grief," said others. Perhaps both were true. Charles was inconsolable. He wept uncontrollably, retreating into isolation, refusing food for days. His body grew thinner, his mind more erratic. He was haunted by visions, convinced that Marie-Louise's death was punishment for his sins or perhaps his family's. Desperate, the court arranged a second marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess whose dowry and connections promised to save Spain from its enemies. But this marriage, too, was barren. The new queen, intelligent and pragmatic, quickly realized the truth. There would be no heirs. She turned her attention instead to politics, aligning with factions and priests, trying to hold together a crumbling court while her husband wasted away. By the 1692, Charles's health had deteriorated beyond concealment. His skin had turned sallow, his hair grayed before 30, his speech slurred into incoherence. He suffered seizures that left him unconscious for hours. At banquets, courtiers watched in horrified silence as he drooled into his food, unable to swallow properly. The empire reflected its monarch's decay. Wars drained the treasury. Provinces rebelled. The once mighty Spanish army, starved of leadership and funds, fell into ruin. Even the church, long the dynasty's steadfast pillar, began to lose faith. Priests whispered that the king was a divine punishment sent to humble Spain. Still, Charles prayed. He filled his chambers with relics and saints' bones. He attended mass daily, kneeling until his frail body trembled. At times, he believed he was possessed, demanding exorcisms to drive out imaginary demons. At others, he wept and begged his confessors to forgive him for being the instrument of Spain's sorrow. His courtiers continued the farce of normality. Ceremonies were held, signatures placed on decrees written by others, treaties signed by a hand barely steady enough to hold a pen. Foreign ambassadors observed in grim fascination, sending reports home of a monarch more corpse than king. Yet even as he wasted away, Charles remained strangely aware of his symbolic importance. He knew that he was the last of the Habsburgs of Spain, that his death would determine the fate of empires. That knowledge gnawed at him, deepening his despair. In the shadows of the Alcazar, amid the scent of wax and decay, Spain became a court of ghosts, priests, nobles, servants, all circling a dying sun. And at the center of it all sat Charles, pale, trembling, praying. A king crowned in suffering, ruling over the echo of greatness. He was no longer man nor monarch, but something else entirely, a relic of faith, pride, and blood, preserved beyond reason. The empire that once spanned the world now seemed to fold inward, mirroring the bloodline that had created it. The ships no longer sailed, the mines no longer yielded silver, the prayers no longer reached heaven, only silence grew stronger. By the dawn of the 18th century, Spain had become a kingdom suspended between prayer and decay. The palace of the Alcazar, once radiant with the laughter of emperors, was now quiet save for the echo of footsteps and the trembling breath of its king. Charles II, last of the Spanish Habsburgs, was only in his mid-30s, yet he looked twice that age. His hair had thinned to wisps of grey, his skin sagged against his skull, and his jaw, the infamous Habsburg jaw, had grown so pronounced that he could no longer chew. He lived on broths and mashed fruit, spoon-fed by trembling servants who prayed he wouldn't choke. Every swallow, every breath, was an act of endurance. The king's body had become the battlefield upon which centuries of genetic pride had finally declared defeat. He suffered seizures that left him unconscious for hours, digestive disorders that wasted his frame, and paranoia that consumed his mind. His world was reduced to ritual, priests chanting, relics carried in procession, exorcisms whispered over his bed. When courtiers entered his chambers, they found him staring into mirrors for hours, searching his reflection for some sign of divine favor, or perhaps for the curse he was certain lived inside him. He believed himself bewitched. He ordered confessions, exorcists, endless masses to purge the evil within. Once, in a moment of terror, he demanded the bones of a saint be laid beside him while he slept, so that the devil may know I am not his. But the devil was not to blame. The truth was far simpler, and far crueler. The dynasty had imploded under its own obsession. By 1698, Charles's health was failing so visibly that foreign ambassadors began sending daily updates on his condition to their kings. France, Austria, England, all of Europe held its breath, waiting for the moment Spain would become an empty throne. His very heartbeat had become a matter of international diplomacy. Within the palace, the atmosphere was suffocating. Ministers schemed over succession plans, generals argued over loyalty, priests debated whether the king's suffering was divine punishment or holy test. The courtiers, once elegant and proud, now moved through the halls like mourners at a funeral that refused to end. Queen Maria Anna of Neuburg, his second wife, had long since withdrawn from him emotionally. What began as pity had curdled into despair. She maintained her composure in public, but in her private letters she called the court a mausoleum disguised as a palace. And she was right. The once glorious Spanish Empire whose ships had carried gold from the New World and whose armies had shaken Europe was now a hollow ghost. Its trade routes were dying, its colonies restless, its cities filled with hunger and rumor. Even the people, long devout, began to whisper that God himself had abandoned the Habsburgs. Still, Charles prayed. Each dawn he dragged himself before the chapel altar, lips trembling, his body racked by spasms. "If I must suffer," he whispered to his confessor, "then let it be for Spain." His faith, though sincere, had become madness. When another seizure left him bedridden, he insisted that witches had entered his blood through the sacraments. He summoned inquisitors, demanding they investigate every priest, every servant. Dozens were arrested. Tortures were performed in his name, as though the agony of others might lift his own. In the rare moments when lucidity returned, Charles seemed haunted by his own reflection. "I am the end," he murmured once to a physician. "My body carries the graves of my fathers." He was not wrong. The Spanish court, bound to appearances, continued to stage ceremonies as if the kingdom still possessed its former grandeur. Trumpets sounded, processions marched, and the king was carried too weak to walk on a gilded chair. Foreign dignitaries bowed before him, careful not to let pity show in their eyes. Behind closed doors, everyone knew the truth. Spain's last Habsburg was fading, and with him, the line of emperors stretching back to Maximilian I, to Charles V, to the age when the sun had never set upon their dominion. In 1700, the seizures became daily. Charles's speech, once slurred, became incoherent entirely. He communicated by gestures, nods, and the flicker of his eyes. His emaciated body was a collection of trembling bones wrapped in silk. Servants had to lift him to dress, to feed, even to pray. And yet, still, he tried to fulfill his royal duty. He summoned scribes, dictated decrees he could barely understand, and signed treaties with a shaking hand that could no longer hold the pen steady. The ink often smeared into meaningless stains like the very mark of his dynasty upon history, once bold, now fading. The final months of his life turned the court into a theatre of dread. Each time he fell unconscious, foreign ambassadors dispatched messengers on horseback across Europe. Was the King of Spain dead? Each time he woke, the messengers were recalled. The continent held its breath, waiting for one man's heart to stop. On the morning of the 1st of November 1700, the palace bells remained silent. Charles II lay pale and motionless upon his bed. His confessor whispered the last rites as the king's eyes, milky and unfocused, fixed upon the crucifix above him. His lips moved faintly, though no one could hear the words. Then, at 34 years old, Charles II of Spain exhaled for the last time. The servants fell to their knees. The priests murmured prayers. In the distance, a storm gathered over Madrid. The same sound that had heralded his birth now echoed at his death. When the royal physicians performed the autopsy, what they found turned legend into horror. The reports described a heart no larger than a walnut, lungs consumed with rot, and entrails filled with corruption. His brain, they wrote, was scarcely half the normal size. His body had become a vessel emptied by centuries of blood, unbroken and unmixed. He had never fathered a child. The Spanish Habsburg line, which had once ruled half the known world, ended with him. His death shattered the fragile peace of Europe. Within weeks, armies marched, and the War of the Spanish Succession began, a conflict that would drag on for 13 years, spilling across kingdoms from Flanders to Italy. The Habsburg dream of empire had dissolved into smoke and gunfire. And yet, amid the chaos, the lesson of Charles II lingered not as a political warning, but as a moral one. The dynasty's downfall was not wrought by enemies or wars, but by the quiet arrogance of men who believed that blood could be purified by repetition. The portraits of the Habsburgs still hang in galleries, faces with proud chins, cold eyes, and the unmistakable deformity of their lineage. But behind the gold frames lies a story written not in paint, but in flesh. The slow, terrible cost of perfection pursued without wisdom. As the candles burned low in the Alcazar that night, the same corridors that once echoed with Mariana's screams of childbirth were now filled with the hush of finality. The empire had fallen silent. The queen who had birthed a monster was long dead. Her son had followed her into the grave, and the bloodline that had once believed itself divine had ended in a broken body that could no longer speak, no longer stand, no longer sustain life. Outside, the bells of Madrid finally tolled not for victory, but for extinction. In that moment, the grand Habsburg experiment reached its conclusion. The family that had ruled by faith, power, and blood had been undone by all three. The silence that filled the palace was not just death's silence, it was history closing its circle.